In the dim light of the evening, inside a dusky room. The doorbell rang, ding-dong. I wiped the tears that had streamed down my cheeks multiple times and looked at the monitor. My mother-in-law and Sherry were standing side by side. Jessica thought, they've come to help. I hurried to the front door. Opening it, I was astonished. Come on, please. Start bringing things in quickly. At the mother-in-law's voice. People who seemed like movers entered the house saying, excuse us. Huh? What? Wait, what's going on? Hearing my confused voice, Mark, who had been in his room upstairs, hurried down the stairs. What's the matter, Mom? As he watched the movers bustling around, Mark asked. That's. Confused, I looked back at Mark, and then my mother-in-law and Sherry spoke. We're taking my son's house. You guys get out. That's right. Get out right now. Meanwhile, my father-in-law briskly gave instructions. And the movers swiftly carried items into the living room and other rooms. Suddenly, Mark, changing his expression, raised his voice, No, that's not okay. Don't you know, ants? Looking at Mark, his face was pale as a ghost. This house, it's not Dad's anymore, and there are ghosts here. My father-in-law turned around, and the movers also stopped in their tracks. With everyone's attention on him, Mark was shivering. I am Jessica, 41 years old. My husband, David, is 42 and a salaried worker. He's gentle by nature, doesn't drink, smoke, or gamble. He works earnestly every day for our family. David's hobby is watching movies with me on weekends. Until last year, our son Mark used to join us, but since entering middle school, he's more often out with friends for club activities or hanging out. Though I feel a bit lonely, David seems to find it heartwarming. He reminisced about not attending the private high school where his parents worked, instead choosing a local public school, becoming class president and student council president, and meeting his best friend there. Your best friend was Phil, right? David, you've always been a top student. I teased him slightly, and David laughed heartily in response. If my parents heard that, they'd be furious. Lost in memories, David mused, still, those were fun times. Are you having fun now? As we watched a DVD at home, David simply answered, yes, it's fun. Then, looking around the living room, he corrected himself. More than fun, I guess it's happiness. We have our own house, a kind wife, and a healthy son. He spoke with a face that clearly showed he couldn't wish for more. Almost embarrassingly content. You should say, a beautiful wife, there. As I playfully raised my arm, David dodged and laughed. Yes, I'm happy with my beautiful wife. Now, I just have to work hard to pay off the mortgage. Our house is still under mortgage. David made sure to take a mortgage that we could afford even without me. A full-time homemaker. Jessica thought, I'm the one who's lucky to have such a kind husband. Watching the DVD next to David, I thought this to myself. David always called our married life happy. But I think he wasn't very happy at his parents' house before we married. It was obvious that he didn't get along well with his parents or his sister Sherry. I heard that the trouble started when David didn't attend the high school his parents recommended. Sherry, 2 years older than David, obediently attended the high school chosen by their parents. She followed their wishes for both high school and college, and even got a job at a company they approved of. My sister can't think or decide for herself. David said she became someone who can't function without being told what to do. She couldn't adapt to different situations or make decisions on her own. As expected, she felt uncomfortable at her first job, where she couldn't do anything without instructions, and left within a year. Then her parents quickly arranged a marriage for her, and she married my brother-in-law. Despite having David, a proper eldest son, they chose to adopt a son-in-law for cohabitation. To me, it made no sense, especially since their father was just an ordinary salaried worker. I didn't see the need for them to stretch themselves financially for private high school either. That's just silly pride. My parents' pride. David explained that there was a wealthy family in the neighborhood of his parents' house. Their daughter was the same age as Sherry. They played together as children, but the girl went to private school from elementary school, setting her apart from the other neighborhood kids. Nothing particular happened with that family, but his parents envied that girl and her family. They were desperate to send their children to private schools too, saving hard to afford Sherry's private high school education. Due to their circumstances, dinner was modest. But Sherry's lunchbox was always extravagant, making for a somewhat funny dietary lifestyle. David didn't see the necessity of struggling to attend a private high school, and chose a public one instead. To me, it seemed like the right decision. But his parents got furious, and their attitude towards David changed blatantly from that day. They seemed proud when others envied the name of the high school their daughter attended. Perhaps they felt embarrassed admitting their son attended a public school. But living above their means for unnecessary prestige wasn't a good thing. The in-laws and Sherry's family, a total of 7 including 3 children, lived in a rented house. I'm not saying renting is bad, but there might have been better ways to spend money than just on appearances. They even went into debt to send Sherry to a private high school and college. And they're still repaying it. I could never understand their mindset or approach to money. This extended to Christmas gifts. What Sherry's children get was blatantly different to what Mark gets. Maybe it was because they lived together, but I felt sorry for Mark. The thought that he too was affected by this made me sigh. To the in-laws and Sherry, it seemed unhappy to the fact that we owned our house. A 2-story, 4-room house, bigger than the in-laws' place. An office, huh? Pretty cheeky for a public school grad. Such a waste on you all. They'd occasionally visit and make such snide remarks. Moreover, they'd point out any flaws like a stain here or discolored rug there, saying, "Not that impressive after all." I couldn't see the point of it. If they didn't like it, they shouldn't come over. David said, "They're probably just jealous. They don't have money, yet they envy us for buying a house, even on a mortgage." He laughed, saying it was because of their false pride. His brother-in-law probably didn't have a low salary. Even his father, in his 60s, was still working. But the debt repayment was holding them back. Don't worry about it. But whenever David and Mark weren't around, the mother-in-law and Sherry would come. Recently, they started wandering around our house while I prepared coffee, discussing things like, "We'll make this our bedroom," or "My husband likes this room," as if deciding for themselves. "What are you doing?" Expressing my displeasure, they immediately put on a fake smile. "Oh, we were just looking around." "Well, you were slow with the coffee." I closed the door of the room they peeked into and asked them to return to the living room. My mother-in-law asking for a spare key gave me chills. I couldn't possibly give a key to someone who roamed around my house uninvited. There was a chance they could enter when no one was home, and rummage through drawers and closets. Despite their harsh treatment of David, asking for a key seemed too selfish. I need to discuss it with David first. I evaded the question for that time and later asked David to firmly refuse over the phone. "How can you refuse to give a key to your parents?" She was angry, but it couldn't be helped since those parents weren't trustworthy. "Please, only come over when Jessica or I am home." David said this and hung up. Health is the most important thing. A phrase often said, but it really hit home this year. David was diagnosed with cancer. We were speechless when the tests, initially for a stomach ailment, revealed widespread cancer. The doctor said he had only a few months without surgery. We had insurance, but it wasn't enough. There were hospital bills, living expenses, and the mortgage. Our happiness crumbled in an instant. I was shaking with fear of losing David and the uncertainty of our future. I was just terrified, not knowing what to do. I'll ask for help from my family. My parents had already passed away. Being an only child, I had no other relatives to rely on. Okay. I'll go too. We explained David's condition to his parents and Sherry's family and asked for financial help. Cancer can often be treated nowadays, right? Sherry didn't seem to fully grasp the situation. The in-laws were hesitant about lending money, though not as much as Sherry. I heard you finished paying off your debt a few months ago. Yes, we finally managed it. Please, I'll pay it back. Lend me the money for the surgery and hospitalization. The money you were going to use for my private school, lend it to me now. Please, I'll start working too, so lend us the money. We desperately sought help. What? No. We've just started to afford some luxuries. If I die, the mortgage will be waived by insurance. We'll sell the house if needed to repay. I'll write a promissory note. We asked repeatedly, begging them. But the in-laws never nodded in agreement. And despite somewhat expecting this, we were in despair. Then why don't you sell the house now? Of course, we knew that was our last resort. But if we sold now, we'd have to deduct the remaining loan amount from the sale price. And make sure there's enough left for hospital bills, treatment costs, and rent for our new home. I heard that David had been sending money home even after moving out during his bachelor days. It seemed only fair that they spend a little on David now. No matter how many times we asked, the answer from the in-laws and Sherry remained the same. David straightened up and replied in a flat voice. Okay, I understand. I ask no more. As we were leaving, the brother-in-law followed us saying, wait a minute. This isn't much, and I'm embarrassed to say I don't have savings. He quietly handed David $1,000. It was obvious he wouldn't have savings, as he had helped with the debt repayment too. Despite their proud claims of finally paying it off, it was also thanks to the brother-in-law. I'll try to persuade them again. Please, don't lose hope. We deeply thanked the brother-in-law. Thank you. Your kindness is more than enough. But still. Do you have any other plans? Yes. Like my sister said, I'm thinking of selling the house. What? I exclaimed in surprise. Selling the house might sound simple, but it involves procedures and takes time. It wouldn't be ready in time for David's upcoming hospital admission. Even if it sold, we still had to find a new place to live. It wasn't going to be easy. It's okay. I have someone in mind who might be able to help. David looked at me and smiled. In the 2 years since David's cancer was discovered, he had fought hard. Despite being told he had only a few months to live, he managed to create many happy memories with us, in and out of the hospital. Although we had grown quite distant, when the doctor said he will never be able to go home anymore, I contacted his family. After that, they visited a few times, but their visits were brief and indifferent. Quickly leaving after remarking, he still seems okay. Jessica thought, it's as if they're just checking how much longer David has. I shook my head quickly to dismiss such a thought. No matter what, it couldn't be. When the doctor said it was time to contact the family, I knew the end was near. I hurriedly called my mother-in-law. Oh dear, that's serious. I must hurry. Yes, please come to the hospital right away. What? Oh. Yes. I'll come if I can. After my mother-in-law cut off the phone, I had an uneasy feeling, but rushed back to the hospital room where David and Mark were waiting. In the end, only my brother-in-law, who came directly from his office, and David's best friend Phil showed up. Still, David opened his eyes slightly, happily seeing everyone's faces before closing them again. The funeral arrangements were helped by my brother-in-law and Phil. While we went home to prepare, my brother-in-law stayed with David, and Phil drove us. It was morning when we left the house, but now the sun was setting. We had left in a rush, so even the breakfast dishes were still out. In the dimly lit house at dusk, I turned on the lights. Sitting in a brightened living room chair, I flipped through a photo album. Tears flowed freely as I looked through it. Wiping the tears that fell on the table, I chose a photo for the memorial service from the album. The doorbell rang, ding dong. I wiped the tears streaming down my cheeks and looked at the monitor. My mother-in-law and Sherry were standing side by side. Jessica thought, they've come to help. Though they didn't make it for his final moments, they had come, and I hurried to the front door. But when I opened it, I was stunned. Come on, please. Start bringing things in quickly. At the mother-in-law's voice. People who seemed like movers entered the house saying, "Excuse us." Huh? What? Wait, what's going on? Hearing my confused voice, Mark, who had been in his room upstairs, hurried down the stairs. What's the matter, Mom? As he watched the movers bustling around, Mark asked. That's. Confused, I looked back at Mark, and then my mother-in-law and Sherry spoke. We're taking my son's house. You guys get out. That's right. Get out right now. Meanwhile, my father-in-law briskly gave instructions. And the movers swiftly carried items into the living room and other rooms. Suddenly, Mark, changing his expression, raised his voice, "No, this isn't okay. Don't you know, ants?" Looking at Mark, his face was pale as a ghost. This house, it's not Dad's anymore, and there are ghosts here. My father-in-law turned around, and the movers also stopped in their tracks. With everyone's attention on him, Mark was shivering. Then, a person entered through the front door. What are you doing bringing stuff into someone else's house? Get out now. Phil's angry voice echoed throughout the house. And possibly the neighborhood, startling everyone. Without checking with their clients, the movers immediately started taking the things back out. Lost about what to do next, the items were left on the roadside in front of the house. Aww. My desk. I turned around at my nephew's voice to see the brother-in-law standing there with his 3 children. As the children complained about their belongings left on the road, the brother-in-law questioned Sherry. I came here after hearing about the sudden move, but what's all this? The usually mild-mannered brother-in-law was angry. What? Mom and Dad said they were moving. What are you talking about? You agreed too. Amidst their ugly argument, the brother-in-law coldly declared. I can't deal with you all anymore. I want a divorce. What? Wait, what are you saying? The brother-in-law negotiated directly with the movers to take only his and his children's belongings to his parents' house. Sorry for the trouble at such a difficult time. For now, I'll have them take my children and belongings to my parents' place. Without giving Sherry another glance, the brother-in-law and the children left with the movers. Sherry collapsed crying on the road, and the in-laws stood dumbfounded with the luggage. Neighbors came out to see what was happening, turning the scene into a nightmare. For now, it's best not to leave this stuff here. Can we move the belongings back inside? At Phil's suggestion, I nodded in agreement. Yes, that's fine. This is your house, we'll follow. What do you mean? The in-laws looked at us, clearly confused. Here's the truth. 2 years ago, the day after being refused money by David's family, he brought a very intimidating-looking person home. That was Phil. He owned a real estate business and even gave me his business card. Apparently, he was David's high school classmate. But he looked so intimidating that I initially thought he might be involved in some shady business. Mark was scared, clinging to me like a child. Worried, I glanced subtly at David. Realizing my concern, David tilted his head and then burst into laughter. It's okay, Phil may look scary, but he's a respectable working man now. Now. Noticing Mark's observation, Phil's eyes widened, and he smacked David on the head. David. I couldn't believe it, David was sick. Yet he was laughing. Mark was so pale I worried if he was still breathing. You didn't come to our wedding, nor visit us even though I invited him. Oh. Then I remembered. David often mentioned of Phil in his stories about school days and when going out for drinks. I had always imagined Phil as a reliable good friend based on these stories, never realizing they were the same person. You see, my scary appearance would only cause trouble at weddings or home visits. That's why you're still single, right? Do you want to be hit again? Their light banter made it clear he was the Phil I'd heard about. I laughed softly as I listened to their conversation. Both of them stopped and looked at me. Oh, sorry. It's just David is acting like a child. What? He's always like this. Phil. Remember, my son Mark is here. A father's dignity is important. Dignity? You never had that. Mark. Even Mark joined in the banter, lightening the mood. I told Phil how disappointed David was that he couldn't come to the wedding, and invited him to visit anytime. Thank you. Now let's get to business. We don't have the luxury of time. Phil's demeanor turned serious. First, let's see the condition of the house. Phil inspected each room, even the exterior walls and meter box, before taking out a laptop and typing something. After a while, he showed us the screen. What do you think of this sales price? I gasped at the amount he proposed. It was higher than what we paid for the house. Thank you for the generous appraisal, but can we really sell it at this price? It's been about 10 years since we moved in, and if it doesn't sell, it defeats the purpose. We hadn't renovated for many years. Like my mother-in-law and sister-in-law said, there are stains here and there, and the floor is old. I heard about that from David. They were talking about how to use each room, right? Yes, that's right. That means they think it's good enough to live in as it is. Don't worry, it will sell at this price. Phil reassured us with confidence, and David also said, you can trust him. Okay, please go ahead at that price. As I asked, Phil quickly laid out several documents on the table. We also need to find a place to move into next. Phil responded to my words with a cheerful yes, and laid out the rental agreement papers as well. First, I will directly purchase this house. That clears your first concern. And then, I will rent this same house back to you. Here, that's your second concern cleared. What? I was stunned by Phil's words, that he continued. Also, I will transfer the money from the house sale to your account in a few days. You can use that to pay off the remaining mortgage. Phil smiled brightly, a smile so pure that it made his intimidating appearance vanish. As I filled out the paperwork, I noticed the rental fee for this house. $100. This surprised David and Mark too, as they both leaned in to look at the document. You mean $1,000, right? As we laughed thinking it was a mistake, Phil said, it's not a mistake. What? I owe David that much. After a moment of thought, David casually said, no, you don't. But then Phil shared a story from their high school days. Phil was really a troublemaker back then. He often got into trouble with the police and frequently got into fights that made his mother cry. One day, Phil's mother, a single parent, was hospitalized due to exhaustion and stress. Seeing his mother so frail and weak, he broke down and cried like a child. He decided to change his ways, quitting fighting and staying out of trouble with the police. However, one day, a cigarette butt caused a small fire at school. Being notorious, Phil was blamed. Despite his denials, no one believed him because of his past behavior. No matter how much he denied it, saying it's not true. Because of his past actions, no one believed him. He thought he would be expelled and make his mother cry again. It was then that David believed Phil's words. He was the only one who believed in my innocence. And he was the student council president at the time. We hadn't even spoken much before that. Phil fondly remembered how David protested to the principal, interviewed students, and found the real culprit. Well, yeah, you said you didn't do it, so I believed you. No one else would have believed me. Thanks to you, I graduated high school, took care of my mom, and even became a business owner. That's why he felt he owed so much to David, Phil explained. We, as a family, looked at each other and gratefully accepted his offer of such low rent. That was what happened 2 years ago. As Mark correctly said, I now own this house and am merely renting it to this family. If you don't believe me, I can show you the documents later. Phil glanced at Mark and then turned back to the in-laws with a smile. However, if you wish to rent the house, I'm happy to lease it to either family at a low cost. Seeing my surprise, Phil smiled. I can also introduce you to new properties. After the funeral, we moved out of the house and into a 2-room apartment Phil had recommended. Just unpack the essentials for now. You'll probably be able to return to that house soon. Grinning, Phil explained his reasoning as Mark, also curious, came closer. I almost wanted to kick them out right then. But I changed my mind. Listen, here's the plan. He leaned in to share a secret with us. 3 days later, we returned to the house saying we forgot something. Phil joined us, and reluctantly, the mother-in-law served tea and snacks. How do you find living here? Not bad at all. Pleased with his response, Mark asked, really? Indeed. No strange noises on the supposedly empty staircase? Or in the bathroom? Looking around the living room with feigned fear, Mark added to the story. Oh right, Mark mentioned a ghost here. Yeah, Mom might not know. But since Dad got hospitalized, there have been weird noises. I saw the hem of a skirt on the stairs, thinking Mom was home, but nobody was there. That's ridiculous. Interrupting her, Mark and Phil simultaneously looked up at the second floor. Is there someone upstairs? Of course, there wasn't. Sherry, depressed after her divorce was finalized, was also in the living room. Stop it, that's not funny. I didn't hear anything. Mark and Phil exchanged glances and hurriedly gathered their belongings. That's great to hear. We'll be leaving now. They rushed out and quickly got into the car. The in-laws, who had come to see us off, looked frightened. Inside the car, we burst out laughing. Phil's plan was to use the lie Mark spontaneously told about the ghost. That's the punishment for being so cold to David for so long. What kind of world do we live in where parents and a sister prepare to move into a house and not caring for their dying son? Phil's words, spoken almost like a bitter throwaway while driving, felt profoundly true. Eventually, it seemed like Phil and Mark kept repeating similar sentiments. And before long, unspoken paranormal phenomena reportedly began to occur in that house. The in-laws and Sherry mistakenly believed the house noises were poltergeists and became unnecessarily frightened. They complained about various things to Phil and Mark, but we never experienced any of it. Misconceptions can be scary, huh? Mark said, laughing. Eventually, unable to bear it any longer, the in-laws and Sherry moved out of that house. Phil had helped them find a new place to live within their budget. That was just business. I made sure to find them a budget-friendly, run-down apartment. Mark and I applauded the grinning Phil. Speaking of which, Sherry, having divorced her husband, had to start working again to pay child support. She seemed to be fully experiencing the harsh realities of life. Now, with the responsibility to care for the parents she once relied on falling solely on her, I genuinely hope she does her best. Eventually, we returned to the house that David and I had bought. Although we couldn't repurchase it, we are still allowed to live there for a rent of $100. The brother-in-law and his 3 children have started visiting us. Sherry has been asking to get back together, but he isn't considering it at all right now. Once a month, Phil comes under the pretext of collecting rent, which is the monthly anniversary of David's passing. After paying respects at the altar, we have dinner together, and is a good advisor to Mark, who is now in high school. And then there's a secret joy for Mark and me. It's the stories of David's student days, shared occasionally at dinner. There are many stories we haven't heard, revealing new aspects of David. As we gather around the dining table, I'm sure David is laughing with us too. Just like a kid making excuses, he would probably say,